Okay, good morning, everyone. We are looking at the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch today, the relevant section of the Shulchan Aruch related to the Mishnah and Gemara we just finished learning. The chapter is chapter 473, Taf Ayin Gimel, right? It's 473, and we're starting with Halacha Lamed Tes, Halacha 39, and it'll go from 39 through 44. So this section of the Gemara and now the Shulchan Aruch essentially had three items to discuss. Number one, the fact that we refill the second cup of wine before we begin retelling the story of the Exodus. That's number one. We're refilling the cup, even though we're not drinking it. We are refilling the cup now before we start. That's the first item. The second item is the child's questions, the manashtanan. And the third item is the response. Those are the three relevant things that we learned in the Gemara that now we're going to see the halachas for. So let's begin. Halacha Lamed Tes. Achakach, afterwards, having told us that we moved the plate away, right? The Shulchan Aruch, like the Gemara, took us through the whole process already. It took us through making the lechareis, setting up the kaida. It took us through the first cup of wine. It took us through breaking the middle matzah. It took us through dipping. All of that stuff is done. And the last thing we did was we moved our plate away to invoke curiosity. Afterwards, one has to fill up the second cup of wine. So move the plate away and then fill up the second cup of wine. This time, when you refill the second cup of wine, you don't need to rinse and wash the cup out. As a rule, as we're going to discuss, God willing, at the Kinnis Torah, before a person makes Kiddush on their cup of wine, the cup is to be rinsed out and washed. That's the halacha. It's to rinse out the cup and wash it before one makes Kiddush. So it says the Shulchan Aruch that this time when you're filling up the second cup, you don't have to do that. Why? Because he's already did that before Kiddush, and therefore that extends to now as well. Okay.
You mean to say you pull out a Kiddush cup from your cupboard
and you rinse and wash it before you
wash and rinse it before
correct.
You
correct.
have to dry it too?
No, actually. No. You rinse and wash before you make Kiddush, yeah. My father's very particular about
that. Have some Indian to leave some water.
My father lives a little bit inside, yeah.
What?
I can't remember. That's my father. That's my father. My father's very particular about this.
Kabbalistic?
Well, that part I believe so, yeah.
If you rinse the cup, you're not getting all that water out anyway, so
yeah.
even if you go like this,
there's even an idea of leaving a little bit of water and then pouring some of that water into the bottle of wine before you pour from the bottle of wine back. Yeah, before you pour the bottle of wine back into the cup, yeah. There is such a thing as well. Okay, so says the halacha here, before a second cup, you don't have to do that because you already did it before Kiddush. Halacha mem, halacha 40. Yeah, you have it beautiful. Even though the person is not required to hold this cup of wine. He will not be holding that cup of wine, or he doesn't need to hold that cup of wine, until he gets to the paragraph which begins with the word lefichach. As shall be explained. We're going to explain after we learn in the next Mishnah, or actually in two Mishnahs from now, we're going to learn that at the conclusion of the recitation of the Haggadah, of the recitation of the story, you say, and therefore, considering everything we went through, we are responsible to praise you and to thank you and offer our praise and song because of everything we just went through. That's what the word lefichach means, therefore. And from there, we begin to say the Hallel. Half of Hallel we say right after Magid, and the other half we finish after the meal. But we begin to say the Hallel then. So you technically do not have to hold the cup of wine until you get to that point, which means after you tell the whole story, when you get to saying Hallel, that's when you pick the cup of wine up, and yet you're filling it up now. There are other points throughout the Haggadah that we pick up our cup of wine. For example, the Hishanda, that's a custom. The halacha required picking up the cup is at lefichach, at this paragraph which begins the Hallel at the end of Magid. So if we're not picking it up until then, why are we filling it up now? Explains the Alter Rebbe. Nonetheless, one is required to fill up the cup of wine right away at the beginning of the recitation of the Haggadah. Why? So that the children should ask, why Why are we filling up a second cup of wine? We haven't even eaten yet. It's not the way of doing it throughout the rest of the year. The rest of the year, we have one cup of wine before our meal, Yom Tov and Kiddush. And here, you're filling up a second one. So we fill it up now to invoke curiosity, right? Remember, we learned this in the Gemara. Remember this? We spoke about this, right? You're looking at me blank stare, yeah?
I'm just trying to understand.
What are we missing?
The child asked, why are you doing it?
We haven't had a meal yet. Usually we have one cup of wine, then we start our meal, and during the meal we have some other wine if we want to. But here we're filling up a second glass before we've even eaten. Yeah, pretty straightforward, right? But this comes from the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, they fill up a second cup of wine. The Kana ben Shoel, and here the child asks the question, right? And we have two different commentaries on what that means. One commentary said, at this juncture you ask. And the other commentary is, no, now that you filled up the second cup of wine, you've now invoked another question. And that's what the Mishnah means when it says, and now you ask.
Was this the last chance for the child?
Last chance for the question.
Because
now we're getting to the story. There was the moving table the way before. There was a dipping the way before. That's right. There were other things we did before to raise curiosity. And this is the last one. Filling up the second cup. But the Alter Rebbe is learning like the Rashbam here. Remember we had this machlokes and how to understand the Gemara? Remember this or no? Right, again, I'll say it again. The Mishnah said, these are the words of the Mishnah.
Maybe if sorry, you could just slow down a bit.
Yeah, sorry.
A little bit.
Okay.
A lot of details.
Yeah. The Mishnah said, you fill up a second cup of wine. The Khan had ben shoyal, and now the child asks the questions. End quote from the Mishnah. So are those two different distinct statements? You fill a cup of wine, and now at this juncture you ask the questions. Or it's a lead on. Having filled up the second cup, now he's going to ask you about that second cup. Right? Those are two ways of understanding the Mishnah. Right? Is it now at this juncture you ask the question because we're about to tell the story? Or now, having filled up the second cup of wine, you've got something else to make him ask a question. Follow? So the Alter Rebbe is learning like that second way of learning. That the filling up the cup itself is to invoke curiosity. Because really, I shouldn't be filling it up until I need to pick it up. I'm doing it earlier to...
Kid doesn't know the difference anyways.
What do you mean?
When he's filling up the cup, he thinks he's going to drink it right away.
Right, which is why he's curious. What's going on? Why filling it up now? Yeah.
Or why aren't you drinking it? Right
Or, yeah, the whole thing's curious, right? Now, we all said a different...
It could be construed as a laying of a mitzvah or something. Even if it were, it's not the reason because it's saying why you filling it up. You already had Kiddush. You had Kiddush already.
We haven't had a meal yet. Then you're filling up another cup of wine.
Could be that why are you having another? Why are you not making a bracha on something you're preparing for a bracha on?
That's not the way the question's phrased. And bracha wouldn't be such a big curiosity because he made a bracha already earlier. I made a bracha earlier on my cup of wine. I wouldn't be making a second cup bracha now anyway.
Yeah, that's the primary reason.
Right. The question is why.
The secondary reason. Letting preparation for a mitzvah, but not yet. Having other things in the interim and then coming back to it, sort of just sort of an aside.
Right, but I think that complicates it.
Oh yeah.
Meaning it's simple enough. It's unusual. We make Kiddush and then we have a meal. Now we make Kiddush already. Now we're not having a meal and giving me a second cup of wine. What are we doing?
Right now, that's the primary.
Just different. Yeah.
I could just see an adult asking the same question.
Sure.
If he doesn't know anything about it.
Exactly.
If he's invited over.
First timer, yeah. What are we doing?
Must be a good wine you drink.
Yeah. Yeah. Now you remember we had a different machlokes in the Gemara. A different machlokes in the commentaries of the Gemara. Is the 4 questions primary or not primary? Remember we learned this? We had the story with the child who asked the question. And Rabbah said, oh, you asked the question. We don't need to do any more questions. And we had Rashbam and Tosfos. Rashbam said, literally, you asked the question. No need for 4 questions because you already asked the question. He didn't ask the 4 questions. He asked about moving the plate away, but that was enough. And then you had Tosfos, which said, no. The point of this question is to lead to the other questions, which is the manashtana. So let's see how the Alter Rebbe learns it. So he's filling up the second cup of wine, and he's doing it earlier to make the kid ask a question. And then the Alter Rebbe continues, and through asking this question about why he's filling up the cup a second time, then the child will have now been provoked or motivated to ask all the other questions, which they are manashtana, etc. So what's the Alter Rebbe learning? That what's primary, manashtana or any of the other questions? Manashtana is primary. And we're going to get him to ask about the second question, second cup, so that from there he'll lead to saying the actual manashtana. Alter Rebbe is learning like Tosfos. Lakayim labana mashanemer, and in so doing, with his children, he will have fulfilled the injunction of the verse, which says, Ki yishalcha bincha machar lemar. When your child will one day ask you, what is all this you're doing? This is what the pasuk says. You'll tell your son, we were slaves, etc. So in order to fulfill that injunction, we're doing this curiosity of filling up the second cup of wine so that he'll get to asking the proper question, which is the manashtana.
Another way,
Continues the Alter Rebbe from the Mishnah. Yeah.
another way to start that conversation is if nobody asks the question, why are you filling up the second cup? The person could say, "Do you know why I'm pouring the second cup?"
That's right. That's exactly.
No.
That's the next halacha. If the child doesn't have the ability, the wherewithal to understand, to ask, the father's got to teach him to ask the manashtana. Tell him, do you notice all these differences? Ask about the differences you see. Yeah, what I'm saying?
Why do we have all these things that raise curiosity when at the end of the game we have to recite these questions anyway?
And the optimal way is to actually have the kid curious. You want to fulfill the verse which says your child will ask you one day, what are you doing? So you want to fulfill that. You want to get your kid to ask, what are you doing? That's the pasuk, right? So that's the optimal way. But if his child doesn't know how to do it, then you teach him. But the best way is to have him curious enough to ask on his own. Yeah.
If you don't, the kid's liable to just disregard what he's saying.
That's it. It's a lesson in education. Get the kid curious. Okay, so if a kid doesn't know himself, doesn't know how to ask himself, you got to teach him. The main way being, if the person has no child or no son, his wife should ask him the questions. The main isha, if he's not married, doesn't have a wife, he asks himself, manashtana, what's that different, etc. Yeah, this is all from the Mishnah, right? This is all direct from the Mishnah, which we learned. Yeah. Then even if two scholars are sitting together, who are completely well versed in all the laws of Pesach, so they have no curiosities about why we're doing what we're doing. They know already. One should ask the other, which is a bit different than we learned in the Mishnah. You remember this? We learned in the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, "Shoyel and zeh." They ask of each other, which sounded like each should be asking the other.
Yeah.
But the Alter Rebbe I pointed that out. But the Alter Rebbe learns, "Shoyel echem emes chaveroi." One should ask the other. One should ask his friend. Not they should ask each other. In English, it's here. One should ask the other, yeah, which is unique, which is a unique reading of the Mishnah, that they don't have to ask each other, but one should ask the other. And then they both say Avodah Mayinu. So one asks, and then they both say Avodah Mayinu. They both say the answer. The other guy doesn't have to ask back. One has to ask the other, and then they both give the answer, which is a little bit of a different reading than we had from the Gemara before.
The one who's asking
also has an obligation.
He's asking for himself.
Well, actually, one's asking his friend.
One's asking.
But once the question is,
for himself, right?
Yeah,
that's why it's both.
Let's break it down. You have to tell the story of the Exodus. Everybody has to tell that story. They're both obligated to do so. Now, question answer is only one to the other, either by listening to the question or by saying the question. But in terms of telling the story, they both have to tell the story, right? So both are required to say Avodah Mayinu, but only one is required to ask the other. This is how it would seem to be my understanding of this reading. They put here in the Gemara, in the footnotes, this is based on the reading of the Gemara with the story of Abaye. Let's look at that.
So, when he's saying that,
let's look at that 1 second. What was the story with Abaye? Uvda da Abaye. Oh. I see. This is how they're learning it. What was the story in the Gemara? Remember the story in the Gemara with the kid? Rabba had his adopted son Abaye at the Seder. Rabba moved the table away. Abaye says, "Hey, why you move the table away?" Rabba said, "Oh, we don't need Manashtan anymore." What does it say afterwards? And Rabba therefore went right away and said Avodah Mayinu. Rabba didn't then repeat the questions, meaning once one person asked the question, the other person doesn't have to say it anymore. But they both have to say the Avodah Mayinu because they're both they're both obligated to say the story. But only one is required to ask the question. So long as one person's asking the question and the other's answering, that injunction has been satisfied. But both are still obligated to tell a story, so they're both have to say Avodah Mayinu, even though only one asked the question of the other. Yeah, clear? Yeah.
So my question is seemingly that this having the child to ask for questions, or the youngest, is it the youngest one? Let's say there is.
It doesn't say that anywhere here.
Oh, okay.
That's the custom.
Okay, but so having the child ask the Manashana is actually like the Raisa then. It's not like
Absolutely
a cutesy thing.
Nope. That's right. It's real.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
You see, everyone has to recite the story, but practically today, you have people taking sections and going around. This person will read this. This person will read this.
Good question.
So
And really, everybody should say it. But the truth is, when you do it that way, when you go around and everybody says a paragraph, they would rely on the halacha, which is that one who listens is as if they read. Like when you listen to someone say a bracha and you say amen. So in that sense, you can do it. Yeah. Okay. Continues. Last paragraph of halacha mem. Likewise, if his children or his wife is asking him the question, right? If he has no children, his wife does it. He himself doesn't have to repeat the manashtana, and the maschem avodah mayinu, he begins with avodah mayinu, the answer. However, we already spoke about this last time. That the Chabad custom is that the reader does say the manashtana, even though you just said the halacha doesn't have to. The Chabad custom is he does read the manashtana. And we pointed out
along with the child
afterward.
Oh, okay.
After the children are done, the reader then says the manashtana himself with the Yiddish translation. That's our custom.
Or sings it or just goes.
Just says it.
Okay, right.
Singing is not obligatory.
Custom.
Yeah. It's nice, but it's not even like a halacha custom. It's just nice.
For sure.
But we pointed out though that first of all, I pointed out that the Chabad custom is that the reader does say the manashtana. We also pointed out that Rambam, remember we read the Rambam, and Rambam says that we read the Rambam. Rambam says that after filling up the second cup, the child then asks 6 questions, and then it says the reader should then say manashtana. So the precise wording of Rambam is that after the child asks questions, whatever those questions are, whether it's the manashtana or whether it's about why you moved the plate or why you filled the second cup of wine, whatever his questions are, Rambam says the reader then says the manashtana.
Even if the child said the manashtana?
So it would seem from Rambam. So even the halacha here that the Alter Rebbe says, once one person asks, whether it's a child, the wife, or somebody else, no reason to ask the questions again. You just go straight to manashtana. The Chabad custom is that the reader does say the manashtana. And I'm telling you, from Rambam, it seems that the reader should say manashtana. Okay? Clear? Okay. Mem Aleph. Halacha 41. This is based on the Gemara we learned on, or was it Wednesday? Sarach Leimar. We have to, the correct wording of the manashtana is, Ein onu matpilim afilu pamachas. That all nights of the year, we don't even dip once. That's what we're supposed to say. Aval, but ein leimar. Do not say ein anu chayavim l'tabel afilu pamachas. Don't say that all other nights we aren't obligated to dip even once. Why? Because if you were to phrase it that way, if a person said all other nights we don't have an obligation to dip once, we don't even have an obligation to dip once, but tonight twice. Shi'eh mashma, the implication would be that you have an obligation to dip twice tonight. And the truth is, we only dip once as per obligation, which is the hainu marash matbilim b'charosis. That's the marar and charosis. That's only mitzvah to dip. Aval tibur rishon, but the first dipping of karpas, einim machmas chiyuv, is not a result of an obligation. It's only to raise the child's curiosity. So therefore, if you phrase it, all of the nights we aren't obligated to dip once, and tonight we dip twice, the implication would be tonight we have an obligation to dip twice. We don't have an obligation to dip twice. We have an obligation to dip once. We do it another time for curiosity. And therefore, the correct way to phrase the question is, all of the nights of the year we don't dip twice. And now we're dipping twice. Or sorry, all the nights of the year we don't dip once without using the word obligation. And tonight we dip twice. Not to give the impression that both dipping of tonight is equal obligation. Not true. Only the modern chareises is obligatory to fulfill the mitzvah of chareises.
Well, because there's the issue with the poison.
Well, machlekes is a dispute if it's an issue of poison or mitzvah. We paskin like Rabbi Shimon ben Tzadok that it is mitzvah, right? But let's just say it's even for the health issue, that would still be an obligation to keep healthy, right? But the first dipping is not obligation in the same way, so much as it about getting curiosity. Halacha Membeis 42, again directly from our Mishnah. Olafi daite shel ben. The father should answer the question based on the understanding of the child. Of the Malamda is how the father should answer the questions. Hatshuva, his answer al she'elotzav to his question. In other words, your kids have to understand the Haggadah. It's a halachic obligation. The same way you were pointing out, Mayor, that the manashtana is a biblical obligation because your child has to ask the question as per injunction of the verse. It's also an injunction in the verse that you answer the question.
Right.
If your kid doesn't understand what you said, you didn't answer the question. So we can't lose the forest for the trees, right? So can get stuck on reading the words of the Haggadah and forgetting that the words of the Haggadah are actually designed to help you fulfill your obligation. What's your obligation? Your obligation is to answer the kids' questions. So answer them. Make sure you understand what you're saying. Right? The Hainu, which this is Amiris Haggadah, the recitation of the Haggadah. Shehi mitzvah sasem, which is a biblical obligation. Even if your kid didn't ask anything because he failed to ask something, so you asked yourself, or your wife asked you, you're still obligated to teach it to your kid. Shenemar, the pasuk says, tell your child that day the answer to the question. So it means there's a few different verses that describe telling your kids the story. Actually, how many? How many times does the Torah say to tell your kids? You should know. When I tell you why you should know, you'll know why you know. The Torah tells you 4 times to tell your child the question.
Oh.
That's why we have the 4 sons of the Seder. Right? The 4 sons are based on 4 different times that the verse tells you to tell your kid.
4 questions.
So 3 out of the 4, it tells you your child asks, and the pasuk gives an outline of the kid's question, and then you answer. In 1 of the 4, it says, and you should tell your children without prefacing any child's question. This is of the 4 sons. Which one is that? The one who does not ask.
Right.
Because the Torah says, tell your child without even him asking. But the point here being is even if your kid didn't ask, you still have to explain it to him. So even if your kid didn't say Manashtana, you still have to explain the story to him in a level that he can understand. Therefore, one is required to recite the Haggadah in a language that the children and his women can understand. Otherwise, what are you doing? We're going to get to the Rebbe's commentary on the Haggadah, and we're going to see about this. Rebbe's going to highlight this idea of making sure that your children and people understand the Haggadah. Rebbe's going to discuss that in his Haggadah. So put a pin in this. Yeah.
So that answers my question, in fact, that I had before. Like, your child asks a question, and you say, "Oh, I'm glad you asked," and then you say, "Avadim Hayinu," and
what did you do?
I'm saying you're just continuing reading the Haggadah. I actually have to answer the question.
Halachically, yes, you have a biblical obligation to explain it to the kid.
Yeah.
In a manner that he understands. Which Rebbe says. So first of all, you have to read the Haggadah in a language you understand. Or if you're not going to read it to them in a language in English, let's say, or let's say you read it in English, but they still don't get it because it's like poetic, it's archaic, Maxwell English language. Or you farish them or at least explain it to them on their level. If they understand well, you farish them explain everything.
Using your own words.
Use your own words, but explain it to the kid. Right? It's not about.
Right.
It's not the Hillim.
Right.
Just recite the words.
Yeah.
It's a conversation.
Right.
It's a conversation that's curated.
Right.
But it's an actual conversation. You have an actual obligation. So your kid interrupts you in the Haggadah and says, "Tati, I have a question." Don't brush them off and say we got to get through the Haggadah.
Right.
You're exchanging the real mitzvah that just presented itself to you because a kid actually asked the question,
Take care.
and he actually fulfilled the biblical injunction, and now you have the opportunity to fulfill the
Right.
biblical commandment to respond and answer him, and you're going to go and read your mumble some Hebrew
Mm.
words because you want to fulfill what Haggadah says to do.
Right. And
Haggadah says to explain it to the kid.
finish before midnight.
Exactly. Don't lose sight of what the real
Yeah,
obligations
don't lose-
are.
now it makes sense. Don't lose sight of the forest for the trees.
As I say, you lose,
Because you have this whole, I've got to finish the Haggadah. Hold your questions for later. We got to finish the Haggadah.
Right.
Oh, this is the
all the Haggadah is built to do this.
questions after.
Exactly. That's correct. I've guessed it. Hello. Tell your guests that you just met a biblical mitzvah here with an opportunity to do a biblical mitzvah by answering the kid's questions.
They should all watch and learn.
Exactly. Okay, tomorrow, God willing, Monday, God willing, we're going to get to some of the outline of the text of Haggadah, and this is going to get to the Mishnah. Right, the Mishnah gave us an outline of how the response has to be. Right, to begin with shame, end with glory. We're going to talk about that all, God willing, on Monday, and then there was commentary. There was commentary on this section that we're going to learn. It's going to be very beautiful. We're going to get to the history of Manash Dana, the history of it, right? Because you remember, we had 4 questions in the Gemara. Marar, matzah, why we roast, and why we dip twice. The leaning wasn't in there. We're going to get into that. Yeah, we're going to get to that. And also some other commentaries, like, for example, this commentary about making sure the kids understand what we're saying. Okay, wonderful day. Good Ner Shabbos and good Chodesh. Chodesh Shabbat and Torah.